The 1970s AIDS activists who saved lives. Care, Courage, Community, New York City, 1979. The night air was quiet, but something strange was happening inside a small hospital ward in Greenwich Village. Young men were getting sick with an illness no one understood. Nurses whispered. Doctors looked nervous. And on the walls, a notice appeared. Unknown infection. Handle with caution. In one corner of the room, a volunteer named Michael adjusted a blanket over a patient named Tom, a 27-year-old teacher who could barely breathe. Michael wasn't a doctor. He wasn't even supposed to be there, but he had promised Tom's mother he'd keep him company because most nurses were too afraid to enter the room. That night, as Michael sat by the bedside, he realized something terrible. People weren't dying only from the illness. They were dying from loneliness and fear. Families stopped visiting. Churches closed their doors. Even some hospitals refused new patients. Michael took a slow breath and whispered to himself, "If no one's going to help, maybe we have to do it ourselves." It was the moment that started a movement. Across town, in a small apartment, another volunteer, Ruth, a social worker, was typing a letter on her old typewriter. The paper read, "We must organize. People are suffering in silence." Ruth had seen patients turned away, friends losing jobs, and neighbors scared even to talk about the disease. She knew silence could kill faster than the illness itself. Within weeks, Michael and Ruth found each other through a local community board. They met in a cafe filled with cigarette smoke and anxious whispers. That night, a handful of ordinary people, teachers, nurses, and friends of patients, decided to form an underground care group. They called themselves the Men's Health Collective. They had no funding, no medical training, and no approval. What they did have was courage. Their first mission was simple but dangerous for the time: deliver homemade meals to patients abandoned by their families. They borrowed cars, cooked in tiny kitchens, and kept handwritten lists of addresses. Every night, they left warm food and handwritten notes that said, "You are not alone." One evening, while making a delivery, Michael noticed a police car parked outside an apartment building. Officers were questioning a landlord who had thrown one of the sick tenants' belongings into the street. Boxes of clothes and books were scattered everywhere. Michael stepped closer, heart pounding. The officer warned him, "Don't touch that stuff. You could catch it." Michael ignored the warning. He bent down, picked up a picture frame from the ground, and said quietly, "Fear won't fix this." That picture, a smiling family photo, would become his symbol of hope. He placed it on his small desk at home and promised himself that every person who lost their family would find a new one in their group. Word spread fast. By 1981, small support circles appeared in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Chicago. They weren't doctors. They were friends, activists, and neighbors who refused to stay silent. They delivered meals, cleaned apartments, and sat beside beds no one else would approach. But their growing compassion drew attention, not always good. One morning, Ruth received a letter with no return address. It read, "Stop what you're doing. You're encouraging danger." Her hands trembled. For a moment, she thought about quitting. She could lose her job, her friends, maybe even her safety. That evening, she walked to Michael's apartment. The group sat in a circle, candles flickering, their faces tired but determined. Michael held up the letter and said, "They think fear can stop us, but every meal we deliver is a message. Care is stronger than fear." The room went silent. Then, one by one, they nodded. The group decided to go public, to speak out, to tell the press what they'd seen. But stepping into the spotlight could expose their names and faces at a time when society was hostile. They didn't know if people would listen or if they'd face backlash from their own neighbors. Still, they wrote their first public statement, signed simply, "For everyone left behind, we will not be silent." A few days later, a local newspaper agreed to print it. Michael stayed up late, staring at the phone, waiting to hear the community's reaction. When morning came, the front page read, "Volunteers defy fear to help the sick." By noon, the phone started ringing. But the first call wasn't from a supporter. It was from the health department. "Who gave you permission to visit these patients?" the official demanded. "You could be spreading the disease." Michael's heart raced. The very people they were trying to help might now get them arrested or shut down. He hung up the phone, looked at Ruth, and whispered, "They're coming for us." When Michael heard the knock on his door the next morning, he froze. For a second, he thought it was a neighbor. But when he looked through the peephole, he saw two men in gray suits, public health officials. They weren't angry. They just looked cautious. One of them held a clipboard. The other wore gloves. "Are you Michael Turner?" one asked. "Yes," he said quietly. "We need to talk about your activities." They sat at his small kitchen table while Ruth watched nervously from the corner. The officials asked question after question. "How many patients have you visited? Do you have training? Who told you you're allowed to do this?" Michael tried to explain. "People were being left alone. We're not spreading anything. We wear gloves, we clean, we bring food. We just want to help." The taller man sighed. "You don't understand how dangerous this could be." Then he left a stack of papers on the table. Warnings, regulations, and a notice that said, "Cease all volunteer medical activity." When they left, Ruth looked at Michael and said, "They're trying to stop kindness." That night, the group met again. Only this time, fear filled the room. Some volunteers were scared of getting fined. Others worried about their families finding out what they were doing. But then, a quiet voice spoke up. It was Ben, a nurse who had secretly helped them after his hospital refused to treat patients with the new illness. "I work with these men every day," Ben said. "They're just sick, not monsters. If the system won't care for them, then we will, permission or not." The group sat in silence. Then Michael stood up. "If they shut one door, we'll open another. We'll go public." That was the night they decided to hold their first press meeting. A week later, in a small community hall in downtown Manhattan, they faced a row of reporters. The walls were plain, the air tense. Ruth stepped up to the microphone, her hands shaking. "We're not here to protest," she said. "We're here to remind people that compassion is not illegal." At first, there was silence. Then one young journalist, a woman from a local paper, asked softly, "Why do you keep doing this if it's risky?" Michael looked at her and answered, "Because fear spreads faster than any illness. We're trying to slow that down." The next day, their story made headlines again. But this time the response was different. Letters poured in, some hateful, but many kind. A bakery owner offered free food. A retired doctor volunteered to help. A church opened its basement for storage. What began as 5 people in a smoky cafe was slowly becoming a movement. They renamed themselves the Care Network. Volunteers came from everywhere. College students, social workers, and even postal workers who quietly dropped off supplies. They built a phone hotline so anyone who needed help could call. It was simple. One number, one message. You are not alone. But not everyone was happy about it. Late one night, Michael was walking home from a delivery when he saw the words spray painted across the wall near their office. "Stop helping them." He stood there in the cold, staring at the dripping letters. For a moment, doubt filled his mind. Was the risk worth it? Could kindness really fight the fear spreading through the city? He didn't have the answer yet, but he knew one thing. If he stopped, people would suffer in silence again. The next morning, Ruth arrived early with good news. "Michael," she said, holding a letter, "a clinic in San Francisco heard about us. They want to team up." Michael read the letter slowly. The San Francisco group was doing the same thing. Home visits, meal deliveries, emotional support, all built by volunteers. They were calling it the Shanti Project. The letter ended with one line that gave him chills. "We believe compassion can heal what medicine cannot." Michael smiled. We're not alone anymore. But just as things began to grow, something unexpected happened. One of their closest volunteers, Ben the nurse, suddenly stopped coming. His phone line was disconnected. His apartment was empty. For days, no one heard from him. Then one afternoon, a plain envelope arrived at Michael's office. Inside was a hospital badge and a short note written in shaky handwriting. They told me to stop helping. I couldn't. I've been moved out of the city. Keep going. Don't let them win. Michael stared at the words for a long time. He felt anger, sadness, and determination all at once. That night he gathered the group and read Ben's note aloud. They all sat in silence, listening to the city sounds outside. Car horns, sirens, the hum of life going on. Finally, Michael said, "If they can silence one of us, they'll try to silence all of us. So we need to grow louder." He picked up the phone and called the journalist who had interviewed them before. "Tell everyone," he said. "Tell them what's really happening. Tell them we're not giving up." And the next morning, their story went national. Headlines read, "Care Network defies fear. Community heroes continue their mission." As support poured in from other cities, Ruth looked out the window at the streets below and whispered, "This is bigger than us now." Michael nodded. "Yes," he said quietly, "but so is the danger." By 1983, the streets of San Francisco were buzzing with quiet determination. What started as a few friends helping neighbors had turned into a full-fledged network of care. Flyers for the Care Network and the Shanti Project hung on cafe windows, church boards, and bus stops. People whispered their hotline number like a secret password of hope. "Call them, they'll help you." Michael and Ruth flew to San Francisco to meet the Shanti team in person. When they walked into the old warehouse that served as the group's office, they were stunned. Volunteers filled the room, packing boxes of food, answering phones, taking down names. On the wall, painted in big blue letters, were the words, "Care is a revolution." That phrase hit Michael hard. For years, they'd fought fear and silence. Now, people were joining them. He realized they were no longer a hidden circle of volunteers. They were becoming the face of something new, community health activism. That afternoon, the two teams held a meeting around a long table. Ruth looked at everyone and said, "We've shown what small acts can do, but we need something bigger. We need to teach others how to care safely, so no one uses fear as an excuse again." They decided to create the first training guide for community caregivers, simple steps on hygiene, safety, and compassion. They printed copies by hand, stapled the pages, and mailed them to volunteers across the country. Weeks later, letters came pouring back. "Your guide helped me care for my brother. My church started a group because of you. We're not afraid anymore." The movement was spreading like sunlight through clouds. But then came the backlash. Television hosts debated whether these activists were putting others at risk. Some politicians called for bans on unofficial health volunteers. The same people who had once ignored them now accused them of being dangerous. One night, during a live interview, Ruth sat across from a local talk show host who sneered, "Why should untrained people be allowed to handle this? Isn't that reckless?" Ruth didn't flinch. She looked straight into the camera and said, "You call it reckless, I call it human. We don't replace doctors, we replace fear with love. That's our only job." The studio fell silent. Even the host didn't have a comeback. The next day, that clip went viral across television news and community boards. For the first time, thousands of Americans began seeing the activists not as radicals, but as heroes. Michael's phone rang nonstop. Reporters, churches, and student groups all wanted to help. He barely slept, spending his nights planning new outreach programs. But the more visible they became, the more pressure followed. One morning, a stern letter arrived from the state health office. It wasn't a threat this time, it was an invitation. They were being asked to speak at a national public health conference. Ruth stared at the letter, speechless. "Michael, they finally want to hear from us." He smiled faintly. "Or they want to control us. Either way, we'll be heard." The conference hall was enormous. Rows of suits, doctors, and officials filling every seat. Michael walked to the podium, his hands trembling slightly. He looked out at the crowd of experts who had once ignored people like him. He began softly. "I'm not a doctor," he said. "I'm just someone who couldn't stand watching people be left alone. We started with one meal, one visit, one act of kindness, and it spread faster than fear ever could." He paused, scanning the crowd. "If you're scared of catching something, catch courage instead." The audience went silent for a long moment. Then, one by one, people began to clap, slowly at first, then louder, until the whole room was on its feet. That applause wasn't just for Michael. It was for everyone who had chosen care over fear. After the conference, something remarkable happened. City officials began meeting with volunteer leaders. Health departments asked for their help designing outreach programs. What had been a forbidden act of compassion was now being recognized as an essential part of public health. Michael walked through the streets that night, past glowing windows and quiet apartments, thinking about how far they'd come. From that first hospital room to this moment, everything had changed. But deep down, he knew the fight wasn't over. The illness still scared people, and misinformation still spread faster than truth. The difference now was that they weren't alone anymore. At their next group meeting, Ruth looked around at the crowded room, dozens of new faces eager to volunteer, and said, "We started because no one else would help. Now the whole country is learning how." Michael nodded, but before he could reply, a young woman burst into the room, breathless and clutching a newspaper. "Look," she cried. "The president just mentioned community care groups in his address. He called them a symbol of American compassion." The room erupted in cheers and tears. After years of being ignored, they were finally being seen. Michael smiled, but his eyes were wet. "This isn't the end," he said quietly. "It's the beginning of something bigger." He looked at the candle burning on the table, the same kind they'd lit during their first meeting years ago, and whispered, "For everyone who was ever left behind." The flame occurred, warm and steady. Outside, the city lights shimmered like thousands of tiny promises, but not everyone celebrated their rise. Far away, certain officials and institutions still believed volunteer networks were overstepping boundaries, and one powerful agency was already planning to take control of their work. And soon, Michael and Ruth would face a choice that could end everything they'd built. The letter came on a cold morning in early 1985. It had the official seal of the U.S. Department of Health printed in bold ink. Ruth unfolded it slowly, her fingers trembling. Inside, the message was clear. The CARE Network and related volunteer organizations are to be brought under federal coordination. Activities must follow new health protocols. Independent operations will be suspended until reviewed. Michael read the letter twice before setting it down. The room was silent. The sound of traffic outside felt distant, like the world had stopped moving. "They're not shutting us down," Ruth said softly. "They're taking us over." For years, they had built their network with nothing but determination, kindness, and trust. Now, the same system that once ignored them wanted to absorb them, make them official, but take away their freedom to act. Michael stood by the window, watching people pass by. "If we join them," he said, "we'll lose control. We'll need permission for everything." "But if we don't," Ruth replied, "we could lose our funding, our spaces, and maybe our chance to reach more people." The room filled with heavy silence. Their dream, the movement that had started with love, was at risk of becoming another government program. That evening, they called an emergency meeting at the old community hall. The lights flickered as dozens of volunteers crowded inside. Some were nurses, some were students, some were just neighbors who believed in helping. Michael stood at the front of the room, the government letter in his hand. "They want us to join the..." he said. "What should we do?" Voices rose all around. "If we say no, they'll shut us down. If we say yes, we'll just be workers in their system. We can't stop now. We've come too far." Finally, Ruth stepped forward. "We started this because people were being forgotten," she said. "If joining them helps us reach more lives, maybe it's worth it. But if they silence our compassion, then everything we built will die." Michael listened quietly. Then he said, "We'll meet them, but on our terms." A week later, they entered a tall government building in Washington, D.C. The hallways were cold and polished, a far cry from the warmth of their small office. They were escorted into a conference room where health officials sat in neat rows, papers stacked in front of them. One official, a man with a serious face, spoke first. "Mr. Turner, Ms. Ellis," he said, "we respect what you've done, but public health needs order. You can't just run operations without oversight." Michael leaned forward. "Sir, with all respect, we didn't just run operations. We filled the gap when no one else would. You want to manage us, but we were never the problem. We were the solution." The official paused. "And you think compassion is enough?" Michael answered, "It's the only thing that's worked." For a long moment, the room went still. Then Ruth pulled out a folder. Inside were hundreds of letters from families, patients, and doctors who had been touched by their work. She slid them across the table. "These people are alive today because of what you call unofficial work." The official read a few lines silently, his expression softening. Finally, he said, "Maybe there's room for both science and humanity." Weeks passed, and negotiations continued. By summer, a new partnership was announced: Community Care Collaboration, a joint effort between grassroots volunteers and public health programs. The Care Network would keep its independence while working alongside official health departments. For Michael and Ruth, it was a victory, but also a farewell. Their small team had grown into something far larger than either of them imagined. At the final meeting in their old community hall, the original volunteers gathered one last time. The same candle burned on the table, just as it had years ago. Ruth looked around and smiled. "Do you remember the first night we met here? We had no plan, no permission, just heart." Michael nodded, and that was enough to change the world. They passed the candle around, each person holding it for a few seconds before placing it back on the table. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Ruth whispered, "Do you think people will remember us?" Michael smiled. "Maybe not our names, but they'll remember what we stood for." He looked out the window at the city lights. Because compassion leaves a mark you can't erase. Years later, historians would look back on those days and call them the beginning of community care in America, the moment ordinary citizens changed how the country faced crisis. The volunteers who once worked in fear laid the foundation for hundreds of support programs, counseling centers, and community health networks that still exist today. Their story wasn't about fame or power. It was about people who refused to let fear win, people who proved that kindness, even in the darkest times, can save lives. As Michael once said in his final speech, "When the world turned away, we turned toward each other, and that made all the difference." The screen fades to black. Soft music plays, text on screen. Inspired by real activists who helped launch community care movements across America during the AIDS crisis. Their courage reshaped public health forever. If this story touched you, share it, watch, like, and subscribe. But for the people who still believe compassion is power, because sometimes the quietest heroes make the loudest change.